Hello everyone, and welcome to my Young and the Restless official 24 channel. Summer's final letter didn't arrive with fanfare or warning. It came folded, crinkled, and pulsing with the weight of everything she'd no way dared to say out loud, and by the time Kyle read the last line, the man who formerly believed he could survive anything Abbott life threw at him was reduced to a silent wreck, shattered in a way no commercial war, no treason, no broken marriage had ever managed ahead. Because this wasn't an attack from an adversary or a twist of fate, this was Summer, the woman he loved, shelling back the last subcast of Verity and leaving him alone with the consequences. Kyle had opened the envelope casually at first, half awaiting another attempt at conciliation or at least a soft farewell meant to ease the pain, but from the opening judgment he knew this was different. The handwriting was steady, deliberate, nearly cold, as if Summer had written it after all the gashes were spent, after the stopgap had burned out, and she began not with love but with an reason that cut deeper than wrathfulness ever could, and reason for letting him believe a interpretation of their life that was no way real. She wrote that she formerly allowed love could survive secrets, that she believed if she defended Kyle from certain trueness, she was guarding their future, but time had shown her that falsehoods don't vanish, they stay, they rot, and also they poison everything they touch. Kyle's hands started to shake as he read on, the room blurring, his casket tightening, because Summer wasn't just confessing to emotional distance or remorse, she was confessing to a choice, a decision she had made long ago that altered the course of their lives, and at the center of it all was Claire. Summer revealed that the Verity about Claire wasn't just complicated, it was ruinous, and worse, it was commodity Kyle should have known from the morning. She explained that Claire wasn't simply a woeful figure caught in the crossfire of family dysfunction, she was the living consequence of a secret Summer had carried alone, a secret that tied her to Kyle in ways he no way understood and now might no way forgive. Summer wrote that times agone, during a moment of fear and confusion, she had discovered information about Claire's lineage that could have changed everything, information that connected Claire directly to Kyle's family in a way that hovered to blow up not just reports but lives. And rather of telling the Verity, Summer chose silence. She chose control. She chose what she allowed was mercy. Kyle stopped breathing for a moment as the words sank in, his mind contending back through every tense discussion, every moment of apprehension, every time Claire's presence had felt wrong without him understanding why. Summer admitted she had manipulated situations, nudged opinions, diverted blame, all to keep Kyle from asking the one question that would have unraveled her taradiddle. Who's Claire, really? And also came the line that broke him fully. Summer wrote that Claire was no way just a stranger or a trouble, she was family, and Summer had known it each on. Kyle's knees buckled as he read, his reverse hitting the president, the air leaving his lungs in a strangled rustle, because this wasn't just treason, it was a theft, of Verity, of agency, of times he could no way get back. Summer confessed that she had watched Kyle struggle with his instincts, had watched him misdoubt himself, had watched him push people down because he tasted commodity was wrong but couldn't name it, and every time she said nothing, she felt herself slipping further down from the man she loved. She wrote that love erected on illusion is still a taradiddle, and by the time she understood that, it was too late to fix it without destroying him. Kyle's gashes hit the runner, blurring the essay, as Summer described the night she eventually accepted that she couldn't stay, not because she didn't love him, but because staying would mean continuing the taradiddle, continuing to let him live in a precisely constructed reality that served her fear rather of his right to know the Verity. She admitted she had been scarified of losing him, alarmed that if Kyle knew the Verity about Claire, he'd no way look at her the same way again, and that fear had driven every wrong choice she made. But the most brutal part of the letter wasn't the concession, it was the clarity. Summer wrote with painful honesty that Kyle merited a life erected on Verity, indeed if that Verity destroyed what they had, and she could no longer be the person standing between him and reality. She told him that Claire's story, formerly completely revealed, would force him to rethink his family, his fidelity, and indeed his identity, and she couldn't be there to watch him go through that, not when she was the reason it had been hidden for so long. Kyle's heartbreaks echoed in the empty room as he reached the final runners, where Summer's tone softened, not into stopgap, but into acceptance. She wrote that there was a time when she believed they were unbreakable, that love like theirs could survive anything, but she had learned the hard way that love without Verity isn't strong, it's fragile, and ultimately it collapses under the weight of what's been left unsaid. She told him she'd always love him, but loving him now meant letting him detest her if that's what the Verity needed. She prayed him not to let her mistake define him, not to let bitterness harden his heart, and not to discipline himself for trusting her. And also, with ruinous futurity, Summer said farewell, not as a pledge of reunion, not as a dramatic oath, but as a release. She wrote that she was leaving Genoa City to eventually face who she was without falsehoods, and that Kyle demanded to do the same, indeed if it meant rebuilding his world from ashes. The last line was simple and merciless. If you ever wondered why I couldn't stay, it's because I loved you enough to stop lying. Kyle goggled at the runner long after the words ended, his gashes soaking the paper, his casket heaving as the full weight of Summer's final Verity crushed him. In that moment, the room felt too big, too empty, as recollections swamped in, horselaugh, pledges, fights, remission, each now tainted by the knowledge that the foundation had been cracked from the launch. Claire's face flashed through his mind, every comma suddenly charged with new meaning, every unanswered question screaming for resolution, and Kyle realized with sickening clarity that Summer hadn't just left him a letter, she had left him a lemon, one that had formerly exploded inside his heart. This wasn't just the end of a relationship, it was the end of innocence, the end of certainty. The end of the belief that love alone could save them. As Kyle folded the letter with shaking hands, his gashes still falling, one Verity settled in with brutal permanence. Summer's final words had destroyed the man he was, and whatever came next, for him, for Claire, for the Abbott family, would rise from remains that could no way be completely repaired. Kyle didn't sleep that night, didn't move important either, just sat there as the hours bled into one another, Summer's letter folded and unfolded until the crimps came soft as cloth, as if he could wear the Verity thin enough to make it vanish, but dawn came anyway, pale and merciless, and with it the consummation that ignorance was no longer an option, because Summer hadn't just shattered his heart, she'd handed him a responsibility he couldn't escape, and every instinct he'd told him that Claire was the morning and the end of it all. By morning, the grief had disgruntled into commodity, sharper, more dangerous, a need to know everything no matter how important it hurt, and when Kyle eventually stood, his legs felt like they belonged to someone differently, shaky but determined, because if his world was going to collapse, he was going to watch it fall with his eyes open. The name Claire echoed in his head as he replayed moments he'd dismissed, exchanges that now felt offered, ganders that suddenly made sense in a way that made his stomach churn, and the more he allowed about it, the more he realized Summer hadn't just hidden a Verity, she had orchestrated a reality, one where Kyle was always half a step before, always replying rather of choosing. He drove erratically at first, the megacity blurring past his windshield, recollections colliding with dubitation, until the question he'd avoided for months eventually took control. Who's Claire to me? And worse, what does she know that I do'n't? When he eventually brazened her, it wasn't dramatic or explosive, not at first, it was quiet, nearly unsupportable in its restraint, because Claire took one look at his face and knew commodity had shifted permanently. Kyle didn't charge, didn't roar, didn't indeed sit down, he simply asked her to tell him the Verity, all of it, no matter how unattractive, because he was done being defended. Claire's silence said further than words ever could, and when she eventually spoke, her voice quivered with the same exhausted honesty Kyle had honored in Summer's letter, as if everyone in this crooked story had reached the same breaking point at different times. She admitted that she'd known for a while that the Verity would come out, that Summer's silence had bought time but not safety, and that the connection between them, between Claire and the Abbott-Newman heritage Kyle carried so heavily, was deeper and more explosive than anyone wanted to admit. As Claire began to explain, Kyle felt pieces of himself crack open, each disclosure hitting like a body blow, because it wasn't just about pedigrees or secrets, it was about identity, about how numerous opinions in his life had been told by a taradiddle he no way acceded to carry. Claire revealed that she'd been caught between gratefulness and guilt, between wanting to belong and knowing that belonging would come at the cost of Kyle's peace, and that Summer's choice to stay silent had trapped them all in a waiting room of ineluctable disaster. The further Claire spoke, the further Kyle understood that Summer hadn't acted alone, she'd acted in fear, in love, and in a hopeless belief that control could replace honesty, but understanding didn't lessen the pain, it stoned it, because it forced him to accept that everyone he trusted had decided what he could handle without ever asking him. When Claire eventually verified the verity about her connection to his family, the words landed with a concave futurity, like the ending of a vault door, and Kyle felt commodity inside him collapse, not rage, not shock, but a profound grief for the life he allowed. He'd been living. He left without another word, not because he didn't watch, but because if he stayed another alternate, he stressed he might shatter fully, and as he drove down, gashes blurred his vision, not just for Summer, but for himself, for the man who had believed love meant translucency, only to learn how fluently it could be bent into commodity differently. Back at the Abbott house, the weight of heritage pressed down on him harder than ever, pictures gaping back like silent judges as Kyle scuffled with whether to expose the verity incontinently or sit with it long enough to understand what it meant, because formally spoken, nothing could be undone. He allowed of Jack, of the pride and prospects woven into every Abbott decision, and for the first time, Kyle questioned whether fidelity to family meant guarding them from the verity or forcing them to face it head-on. Summer's voice echoed in his memory, loving him enough to stop lying, and it twisted the cutter deeper, because she had formerly chosen her path, leaving him to walk through the wreckage alone. When Jack eventually noticed commodity was wrong, Kyle didn't soften the blow, he couldn't, not presently, and as he revealed what he knew, watched his father's face change from confusion to unbelief to commodity dangerously close to desolation, Kyle realized this was the real fallout Summer had advised him about. The secret didn't just fracture connections, it rewrote history, forcing every Abbott to question once opinions, alliances, and hypotheticals they'd taken for granted, and Kyle set up himself standing at the center of a storm he no way asked for, mourning a love he'd lost while dismembering the vision of stability his family depended on. Rumors spread presto in Genoa City, whispers threading through boardrooms and living apartments. Likewise, and Kyle felt exposed in a way he no way had ahead, his private pain turning into public spectacle, because secrets this big no way stay contained for long. And yet, through it all, it wasn't the gossip or the fallout that hurt the most, it was the absence. Summer's absence. Every instinct told him to call her, to demand answers, to scream and supplicate and charge, but he knew that door was closed, not by distance but by choice, and that futurity sat heavier on his casket than any disclosure about Claire ever could. Nights came the hardest, silence amplifying remorse, and Kyle replayed every moment with Summer, searching for signs he'd missed, moments where the verity had floated just beneath the face, staying for courage neither of them had held at the same time. He wondered if effects could have been different, if honesty before would have saved them, or if the verity about Claire had always been a ticking timepiece fated to destroy them no matter what, and the not knowing was its own kind of torture. Sluggishly, grief gave way to commodity steadier, not remission but resoluteness, because Kyle realized that while Summer's final letter had destroyed the man he was, it had also stripped down his visions, leaving him raw but clear-eyed, able of choosing what came next without the fog of deception. He began to understand that loving Summer didn't mean chasing her or excusing her choices, it meant recognizing the verity she'd eventually given him by refusing to live in denial presently. And as he stood one evening at the window, the megacity lights fluttering like distant stars, Kyle accepted a reality he no way wanted, that love can be real and still end, that intentions do and abolish consequences, and that occasionally the most painful farewells are the bones that free you to eventually see easily. Summer's letter had ended one chapter of his life in remains, but as the dust settled, Kyle knew another was beginning, one erected not on comfort or vision, but on verity, no matter how important it bring, because from this moment forward, he'd no way again allow someone differently to decide what he could survive. Kyle allowed. He'd reached the bottom of his grief, but grief, he learned, was concentrated, deceptive, able of opening doors beneath your bases just when you allowed. You'd set up solid ground. Days passed after the verity exploded through the Abbott family, yet the shock refused to fade, moping in the air like bank after a fire, surcharging his eyes every time he tried to breathe typically. Every corner of his life sounded visited by what he'd lost and what he now knew, Summer's horselaugh echoing in apartments she no longer enthralled, Claire's name sparking pressure in exchanges that fell into awkward silence the moment Kyle entered. Genoa City had a way of devouring secrets, biting them up and sticking them back out twisted and amplified, and Kyle felt himself getting a character in a story he no longer honored, the former golden heir at law reduced to a man rebuilding himself from emotional debris. He tried to bury himself in work, throwing long hours at jabot-like armor, but spreadsheets and strategy couldn't drown out the verity, and every decision felt heavier now, burdened with the knowledge that his instincts had formerly been hoofed by love he trusted too blindly. Jack watched him with concern that framed on guilt, as if seeing his son's pain forced him to defy his own failures, and though they spoke frequently, there was a carefulness between them, a participated understanding that some injuries couldn't be soothed with consolation. Kyle wondered if this was what Summer had meant when she wrote about rebuilding from ashes, this slow, grinding process of learning how to stand without the emotional scaffolding he'd leaned on for times. Claire, for her part, kept her distance, not out of incuriosity but respect, and that space hurt nearly as important as her propinquity formerly had, because Kyle couldn't decide whether seeing her again would bring clarity or chaos. When they eventually crossed paths suddenly, the pressure crepitated between them, thick with implied words, and Kyle realized that the wrathfulness he'd anticipated to feel had softened into commodity more complicated, a reticent empathy that made him detest the situation indeed more. Claire confessed she was leaving city, not in dramatic exile but quiet retreat, understanding that her presence only strengthened the fractures, and as Kyle watched her go, he felt the strange pang of untreated verity, a sense that check was a luxury none of them were entitled to. Her departure didn't abolish the consequences, it only underscored them, leaving Kyle alone with questions that had no satisfying answers. Summer's absence impended larger with each passing day, her name spoken precisely by musketeers who didn't know whether to condemn or console him, and Kyle set up himself defending her indeed as his heart cracked again each time he did. He wasn't ready to forgive, but he refused to reduce her to a villain, because love, still defective, had been real, and admitting that felt like the only way to keep bitterness from consuming him. Nights were the worst, sleep fugitive as recollections replayed without mercy, and in those quiet hours Kyle brazened an uncomfortable verity about himself. He'd wanted certainty so poorly that he'd accepted silence in its place, and that consummation soaked worse than blame. Sluggishly, nearly gradually, he began to change, not in dramatic gestures, but in subtle shifts of perspective, questioning motives, averring on clarity, indeed when it made exchanges harder. Genoa City noticed, whispers circulating about the new Kyle Abbott, colder, sharper, less willing to play on, and while some mistook his resoluteness for arrogance, those closest to him honored it for what it was: survival. The turning point came not in a boardroom or battle, but in a moment of unanticipated quiet, when Kyle stumbled upon Summer's handwriting again, not the letter that shattered him, but an old note put away into a forgotten book, sportful and loving, a relic of who they'd been before fear took the wheel. He cried also, deeply and without restraint, mourning not just the woman he'd lost, but the man he'd been when trust felt safe, and in that release, commodity inside him loosened. He realized that adhering to the wreckage wouldn't bring Summer back or undo the verity about Claire, it would only trap him in an interpretation of the history that no longer was. Acceptance didn't arrive as peace, but as authorization, to move forward without erasing what had been meaningful, to carry love and loss side by side without letting either define him fully. As weeks turned into months, Kyle began to re-engage with the world, not pretending to be healed, but refusing to remain broken, forging new connections predicated in honesty that occasionally felt brutal but always felt real. He didn't know if Summer would ever return or if their paths would cross again, and he learned to sit with that query without letting it riddle him out. In quieter moments, he hoped she'd set up what she was searching for, a life unburdened by falsehoods, indeed as he conceded the endless mark she'd left on his heart. The verity about Claire continued to ripple outward, reshaping alliances and forcing uncomfortable reckonings throughout Genoa City. But for Kyle, the chaos gradationally retreated into background noise, less defining than the choices he made each day to live else. He discovered strength in vulnerability, clarity in battle, and adaptability in facing pain head-on rather than dodging it, and while the scars remained, they no longer mandated his every move. One evening, standing alone beneath the megacity lights that formerly felt mocking in their incuriosity, Kyle allowed himself a fragile sense of stopgap, not for a specific outgrowth, but for the knowledge that he could endure, acclimatize, and indeed love again without surrendering his right to verity. Summer's final letter had destroyed his old world, yes, but in its wake, it had given him commodity unanticipated, the chance to become a man defined not by secrets kept or trust betrayed, but by the courage to face reality no matter how important it hurt. And as he turned down from the history and stepped into an uncertain future, Cal understood that ruin wasn't the end of his story, it was the brutal mourning of a life lived without visions.